welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're immersing ourselves in, well, one of the most high-stakes, symbolic, and let's be honest, heavily politicized arguments out there. The Nobel Peace Prize.
It really is.
And when we talk about this award, especially, in the context of leaders who generate just extreme passion and controversy, we find pretty quickly we're not just debating diplomacy, we're really debating mythology.
That's a good way to put it. Mythology.
Yeah, the Nobel Peace Prize is this really fascinating hybrid, isn't it? It's part high-minded idealism, sure, but it's also part strategic reputation management and maybe even part brutal hardball politics.
Definitely.
So when the question comes up, like, does a prominent, often controversial leader, and specifically in our sources, former President Donald J. Trump, does he deserve the award? The public argument, it just becomes less a forensic look at diplomatic success and much more like a cultural test, a test of political allegiance. Whose side are you on?
Exactly. It gets tribal fast.
So our mission today is to try and move past that noise. We're using the sources you've provided to hopefully establish a clearer, more objective framework.
Yeah.
We want to understand the complicated history of the prize itself, the specific diplomatic acts that were cited for these formal nominations, the intense psychological stuff driving the polarization of the debate.
Yeah, the why.
And crucially, what the expert consensus actually says about the true measure, the durability of the peace achieved in these cases.
And to anchor all that, we really have to start at the very beginning. It all goes back to Alfred Nobel's will, right? Signed back in 1895.
Right.
He wrote that the prize should go to those who conferred the greatest benefit to humankind. Which sounds, well, beautifully pure, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Very idealistic.
But almost immediately, the administration of the prize, which started in 1901, found itself on this incredibly tightrope walk, balancing that moral aspiration, that hope for lasting global peace, with realpolitik, the messy, often contradictory reality of international diplomacy.
That makes sense. Ideals meet reality.
And this constant balancing act, it's why the prize has always been an institution defined just as much by its controversies as its triumphs. We celebrate figures like Mandela, of course, but we can't ignore the intense internal conflict caused by choices like, say, Yasser Arafat and Henry Kissinger sharing the prize in 1973.
Oh, that was a big one.
Huge. Sources note that 2 members of the 5-person Nobel Committee actually resigned in protest over that specific decision.
Wow, resigned.
Yeah. It just shows how volatile the award has always been when it gets tangled up with ongoing unresolved conflict.
That's really essential context, isn't it? It tells us the committee, despite its, lofty status, has always been caught up in high-stakes political symbolism.
Absolutely.
It's a human institution operating under intense pressure, often making choices that are, well, deliberately political, like the 2010 award to Liu Xiaobo, the jailed Chinese dissident.
A clear statement.
Yeah, that was clearly read as a high-stakes political statement against Beijing. Right? So this precedent helps us understand that when we talk about a controversial nomination today, we're talking about an award that has never been, universally agreed upon.
That's such a critical point to establish before we dive into the specifics. It's not some ivory tower making pronouncements.
Right.
It's an institution making really tough moral and political calls, often in real-time history.
Okay, so given that history, that context, let's move into the mechanics of the nomination process itself, because this is where I think the public conversation around the former president's potential award usually goes completely off the rails.
Oh yeah, big time.
The public talk focused on 2 main diplomatic efforts, right? First, the unprecedented U.S.-North Korea summit diplomacy across 2018 and 2019,
The
handshakes. And second, the U.S. brokered Abraham Accords in 2020. These were the main things cited in the formal submissions sent to Oslo.
And this is where we absolutely need to clarify that fundamental critical technicality, the one that gets deliberately blurred, frankly, in partisan public debate.
Which is?
The vast, immense difference between a nomination and an actual award. A formal nomination is just an entry point. It gets you considered. And the gate to get nominated is, well, it's wide open.
Okay. How wide open are we talking?
Look at the sheer scale of who's eligible to nominate. The list is truly vast. It includes members of all national parliaments and national assemblies worldwide.
All of them?
All of them. Certain university professors, specifically those holding chairs in fields like law, theology, history, political science, former Peace Prize laureates themselves, sitting heads of state.
Wow. So it's almost Well, it sounds almost absurdly easy to get nominated, doesn't it?
It's relatively easy, yes, compared to winning.
The fact that just a single well-placed politician in, say, a smaller country, or maybe a handful of academics who meet the criteria, they can put forth a name.
That's right.
So that means a nomination is less a mark of actual merit, maybe, and more just a measure of political reach or visibility.
Precisely. That is the key takeaway. And it's the one that's so frequently overlooked or sometimes, actively obscured in the public narrative.
Okay, spell it out.
A nomination emphatically does not equal any endorsement whatsoever by the actual decision makers, the 5-person Norwegian Nobel Committee.
Right. Zero endorsement.
Zero. Thousands of individuals get nominated annually. Many, many prominent figures are nominated repeatedly, sometimes for decades, without ever winning.
So getting nominated multiple times doesn't mean much either.
Not necessarily for winning, no, but that nomination status, it often gets weaponized in politics. It allows public figures to immediately conflate being considered with having deserved or even won the prize.
Ah, I see. It creates this powerful but, totally misleading narrative.
Exactly, which is why we see constant fact-checking around this specific point.
And we also have to acknowledge, based on the sources, that some of these nominations are pretty clearly driven by partisan motives, right? Or geopolitical signaling.
Absolutely. That's a huge factor.
Like a politician in maybe a European ally country might submit a nomination for a U.S. president specifically to signal political alignment, maybe, or to reward some perceived supportive action.
Yeah, sure.
Rather than strictly based on some sober, nonpartisan judgment of long-term peace-building success. It's kind of part of the global political dance.
That observation is crucial, and the Norwegian committee is extremely sensitive to it. They know this happens.
So how do they filter it out?
Well, to try and filter through all this political noise, their traditional criteria heavily involve looking for long-term, verifiable humanitarian work, sustainable peace-building efforts.
Verifiable being key.
Key, and a demonstrated reluctance on their part to reward short-term publicity stunts or, transient agreements that might not last. Recent reporting, even as late as 2025, really emphasizes the committee's independence and its focus on resisting active public pressure campaigns.
So they try to stay above the fray.
They try. It suggests they prioritize durable outcomes and their own institutional integrity over, say, flashy optics or partisan demands.
Okay, so if the committee is genuinely looking for durability, for structural change, that brings us perfectly to the two main pieces of evidence our sources cite for the nominations.
Right, the case studies.
We need to assess that core contradiction in both cases. Do these diplomatic acts represent, transformative, lasting change, or were they primarily transactional realignments and maybe symbolic steps aimed more at political gain?
That's the million-dollar question for the committee.
Let's start with case study 1, the U.S.-North Korea summits of 2018 and 2019. Now, from an optics perspective, wow, these were undeniably monumental.
Huge photo ops.
The spectacle of the first ever high-visibility summits between a sitting U.S. president and North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un. It created extraordinary political capital, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The images, the handshake across the DMZ, they were broadcast everywhere.
And the fanfare instantly jumped to claims that, decades of nuclear tension were finally being resolved.
The hype was intense. But the problem arises when you peel back those optics and actually examine the outcome.
Okay, what did happen?
Well, the initial declaration in Singapore sounded ambitious, sure, but the follow-through on verifiable denuclearization commitments, it was profoundly limited.
Limited how?
Analysts point specifically to the breakdown at the Hanoi summit in 2019. North Korea was willing, apparently, to partially dismantle the Yongbyon nuclear complex, which is significant, symbolically at least.
Right.
But they demanded comprehensive sanctions relief in return. Basically lift all the major sanctions for dismantling just one part of their program.
And the U.S. side?
The U.S. side refused. They wouldn't agree to that kind of step-for-step process without a much broader, verifiable dismantling of North Korea's entire nuclear program, which includes ballistic missiles, covert sites, the whole arsenal.
So a stalemate.
Pretty much. The failure to secure concrete, measurable progress beyond maybe a temporary pause in missile tests means that experts widely conclude these summits. Well, while symbolically important for starting a dialogue.
Which is something.
It is something. But they lacked the verifiable dismantlement mechanisms needed for credible, long-term peace credentials in the Nobel context.
Okay, so the diplomatic effort was unprecedented, that's fair. But the structural change, It just wasn't there or wasn't completed.
Exactly.
So in the Nobel Committee's traditional ledger, if the missile systems are still there and the nuclear sites aren't fully dismantled and monitored, the action kind of defaults to the symbolic category, regardless of how good the handshake looked.
That seems to be the prevailing expert view, yes. The committee generally looks for evidence of the permanent removal of the capacity for conflict, not just a temporary cooling off period.
Got it. Okay, let's transition then to case study 2, the Abraham Accords in 2020. This one presents a different kind of achievement, right? And maybe a more complex debate.
I'd say so, yes. This was that series of U.S. brokered normalization agreements between Israel and several Arab states, the UAE, Bahrain, later Sudan, and Morocco.
Now, supporters, naturally, they hailed this as pragmatic, historic, a breakthrough. Broke decades of diplomatic stasis.
That was the narrative.
They argued it expanded Israel's regional acceptance, created vital new economic and security links, and showed that the Middle East could maybe evolve beyond that traditional Arab-Israeli conflict framework. And the White House at the time actively promoted the narrative that these accords were a pivotal international legacy, definitely worthy of international honors.
They pushed that angle hard, but the critical lens applied by opponents, it focused heavily on what the accords required to happen, and maybe more importantly, what they ignored.
Okay, what did they ignore, according to critics?
Critics noted that fundamentally, these agreements strategically sidestepped the core Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The central issue of Palestinian self-determination just wasn't really part of the deal. They achieved peace, or normalization rather, between Israel and states like the UAE and Morocco. States that had never actually been in an active state of war with Israel to begin with.
That's a key point. They weren't ending a hot war.
Correct, which is why opponents tend to label the accords as highly transactional diplomacy rather than durable conflict resolution.
Transactional how? What were the transactions?
Well, they point to specific concessions reportedly made by the U.S. to secure the deals. For example, recognizing Morocco's sovereignty over the disputed Western Sahara territory.
Which is controversial in itself.
Highly controversial. For critics, this was a clear example of brokering geopolitical alignment for immediate strategic gains, a transactional benefit for specific states potentially, at the expense of broader rights-based conflict resolution, which is often, a key criterion for the Nobel Prize.
That nuance is crucial for anyone trying to understand this. It really highlights the difference between normalization between states and comprehensive peace that resolves underlying conflict.
Right.
So, if the agreements stabilize one set of relationships but actively ignore or maybe even undermine the prospects for resolving the region's main historical tension, does it qualify as greatest benefit to humankind?
That's the debate.
It leaves us with the same fundamental tension, doesn't it? Are we judging the groundbreaking effort, the disruption, the new alliances, or are we judging the verifiable long-term structural integrity of the peace that's actually achieved?
And that tension, that ambiguity, is exactly what explodes into the public sphere. It becomes fuel for the fire.
Yeah.
So we kind of have to pivot now from the, let's say, objective facts of the diplomacy to the much murkier waters of social psychology. How does this debate actually function as a cultural test of allegiance?
Right. We've laid out the facts, but how did the argument get so incredibly heated?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because the debate is rarely, as you listen to it, about the fine details of the Yongbyon nuclear complex or sovereignty over Western Sahara.
No, not usually.
It's driven almost entirely by pre-existing political identity. Who do you already support or oppose?
Okay, explain that.
Well, this is classic motivated reasoning and identity protection at work. These are psychological concepts that help explain why two people can look at the exact same set of facts, say the Abraham Accords, and draw completely opposite conclusions.
How does that work?
If a leader is perceived as, one of us, part of my group, then supporters are psychologically primed. They're motivated to accept symbolic achievements.
Like a summit photo op.
Exactly. Or a normalization treaty signing. They're primed to see these as profound, game-changing moral capital. They'll actively seek out information that confirms the leader's success and, often unconsciously, ignore or downplay evidence that suggests the progress was limited or flawed.
Okay, that makes sense for supporters. What about opponents?
Conversely, for opponents who are seeking identity protection for their political group, those exact same acts are viewed through a lens of extreme skepticism, even hostility. They are immediately treated as opportunistic, superficial, maybe purely cosmetic for political gain. They are motivated to find the evidence of failure or cynical maneuvering or negative consequences.
So this is why one side sees the Accords as like transformative regional integration, and the other sees them as purely transactional side deals that completely bypass justice for Palestinians. The political identity acts like a filter on reality itself.
It really does. It shapes perception profoundly.
And this ties into another complex idea our sources flag, this concept of the moral balance sheet, and something psychologists call moral licensing.
Yes, that's a really key insight into the inner workings of political support, especially for controversial figures.
How does moral licensing work here?
When we talk about moral licensing in this context, we're talking about this psychological trade-off where some followers might mentally tally up a leader's positive external achievements, like breakthroughs in diplomacy, and weigh them against highly controversial domestic behavior, maybe inflammatory rhetoric, or perceived ethical shortcomings.
Okay, give an example.
For instance, a supporter might feel a genuine unease about, say, a leader's policy on immigration or their rhetoric about democratic institutions. But then, if that same leader suddenly achieves a high-profile international success, like brokering the Abraham Accords,
Right.
the supporter can use that global win as a form of, like, moral compensation. The feeling might be, consciously or not, well, maybe the domestic stuff is messy or problematic, but look at the incredible global peace achievements.
Oh, no.
So the desire to see them awarded a Peace Prize in this context can become a powerful public way to try and certify their leader's overall morality on the global stage, to sort of counterbalance the domestic criticism.
So the prize itself becomes less about certifying the peace achieved and more about justifying continued support for the person who brokered it.
It can function that way for some people, yes. It helps resolve cognitive dissonance.
And this intense polarization, the psychological dynamic, it's just amplified exponentially by our modern information ecosystem, right?
Oh, absolutely. Our media landscape, social platforms, they're almost designed to amplify symbolic acts and create maximum drama. But in doing so, they dangerously blur that critical distinction we talked about earlier between a mere nomination, which is relatively easy to get, and an actual award from the committee, which is incredibly difficult.
And this blurring is how political campaigns can successfully spread the idea, the misinformation, that a leader has already deserved or effectively won the prize just by being nominated.
Exactly. Which necessitates repeated debunking by fact-checking organizations. We see this cycle constantly.
Yeah, you see the pattern. A formal nomination gets announced, maybe by some friendly foreign politician.
Right.
The media cycle jumps all over it, and the debate instantly shifts from, okay, should they actually win based on the merits? To see, they were nominated, this proves their success, and critics are just biased.
Precisely. And this leads to these cycles of what you might call performative outrage. Well, you get extreme outrage from supporters that the leader hasn't won yet, feeding narratives of unfairness, maybe a depth state system denying deserved credit. Or you get intense outrage from opponents that they were ever even nominated in the first place, which just hardens opposition attitudes and confirms their view of the leader's unsuitability.
So it's just constant high drama.
Exactly. And this drama prevents any sort of sober, deliberative public consensus on the actual substance of the achievements. The prize itself becomes just another prop in the political mythology that will inevitably shape how this whole political era is interpreted by future historians.
Okay, let's try to pull back from the drama then and turn to the more sober judgments. What about the experts who actually track the Nobel Prize process, independent of political identity? What's the mainstream scholarly assessment when you factor in that need for durability?
Well, the consensus among Nobel watchers, historians, political analysts who study this closely, it tends to be pretty consistent and overall quite lukewarm regarding these specific cases.
Lukewarm.
They generally caution that the initiatives were mixed in substance and, crucially, largely incomplete in terms of lasting, verifiable outcomes.
Okay, break that down for the two cases.
For North Korea, while the talks were groundbreaking in just establishing dialogue, they ultimately yielded limited, verifiable, sustained denuclearization. And in fact, North Korea resumed missile tests after the summits broke down, which kind of demonstrated the lack of deep structural change.
Right. Actions speak louder than summits.
Pretty much. And similarly, for the Abraham Accords, while they dramatically changed regional alignments and definitely facilitated economic and security benefits for the signatory states.
Which is not nothing.
Not nothing at all. But they deliberately failed to address or resolve the core, long-standing Israeli-Palestinian issue. That left the region's main historical conflict driver completely unresolved.
So the scholarly bottom line seems to be, the candidacy is viewed as politically plausible because, yes, legitimate nominations were filed.
Correct. The nominations exist.
But substantively weak when measured against the high bar for the ultimate prize.
That's generally the assessment, yes. This perceived weakness stems directly from the Nobel Committee's traditional deep-seated demand for durable, structural outcomes and sustained, often multilateral efforts, not just high-profile announcements or transactional realignments.
And they wait, right. They often wait years.
They typically wait years, sometimes decades, to see if peace efforts truly stick, if they become embedded before they bestow the honor. They value longevity.
Okay, but let's make sure we represent the other side fairly. What do the proponents say? Why does this specific style of, let's say, disruptive diplomacy merit recognition, even if it's incomplete?
That's a fair question. Proponents, often those who support a more disruptive, less conventional foreign policy approach, argue that sometimes high-profile, fast-moving, unconventional diplomacy is exactly what's needed.
Why?
To smash decades-long diplomatic stalemates. They believe this kind of disruptive approach merits recognition because maybe by sheer force of will or by breaking established conventions, it creates new spaces for negotiation where none existed before.
So reward the breakthrough, the opening.
Essentially, yeah. Reward the act of starting something potentially revolutionary, even if the implementation is still messy or incomplete. Value the disruption itself.
Okay, that's a legitimate diplomatic philosophy.
Yeah.
That shaking up the status quo is sometimes the greatest benefit. But what about the skeptics? What's their counter on the inconsistency argument?
Right. The skeptics focus not just on the diplomatic results themselves, but on the concurrent behavior and policies of the leader involved.
The bigger picture.
Exactly. They'll highlight concurrent policies like withdrawals from major international agreements, think Paris Accord, Iran nuclear deal. They point to strained relationships with traditional allies, like within NATO. And they emphasize the highly inflammatory domestic and international rhetoric that often accompanied these diplomatic breakthroughs.
Okay, and their argument is?
Their argument is that these other actions actively undermine the spirit of global fellowship and institutional cooperation, which they see as fundamentally part of Alfred Nobel's broader, more holistic vision for the prize.
Right. Not just peace deals, but promoting fraternity between nations.
Precisely. So for this camp, granting an award to a leader whose broader policies were seen as undercutting multilateralism and international norms would be, well, morally inconsistent with the prize's core purpose.
Okay, that brings us squarely to the core ethical and institutional considerations. What are the potential risks highlighted by Nobel experts if the committee were to award the prize prematurely or under these kinds of highly politically charged conditions?
Experts who watch the prize closely have outlined 4 pretty significant dangers. The first is the risk of premature legitimization. Meaning, if the prize rewards surface-level diplomacy or incomplete actions, say, rewarding the handshake with North Korea without verifiable dismantlement actually happening, it potentially demotes the importance of deep structural solutions and comprehensive justice.
It lowers the bar.
It potentially lowers the bar for what counts as peace, favoring quick, highly visible wins over the harder, slower work.
Okay, risk number 1. What's 2?
The second is the substantial politicization risk. This is huge. If the award is perceived, rightly or wrongly, as a partisan reward, as something given to validate one political faction's leader, rather than a principled, nonpartisan moral judgment, it could seriously, perhaps permanently, undermine the institution's credibility on the global stage. The Nobel Prize depends, fundamentally, on its perception of independence.
Lose that, lose everything. Got it. Third risk.
Third is moral inconsistency. As we kind of touched on, awarding the prize to a leader whose broader policies or rhetoric are widely judged as actively undercutting democratic norms, human rights, or international stability, well, it risks sending profoundly mixed messages.
Yeah.
What values is the prize actually supposed to uphold? Does a diplomatic win suddenly outweigh perceived damage to democratic institutions or alliances? It creates confusion.
Okay. And the final risk.
And finally, perhaps the most immediate in today's climate is the massive propaganda risk.
Explain that.
Sources worry intensely that if an award like this is given under controversial circumstances, it instantly becomes a kind of partisan cudgel on the domestic political front.
How so?
It allows political campaigns and supporters to shift the entire focus away from, say, controversial domestic policies or ongoing legal challenges, and point instead to global vindication by the Nobel Committee.
Ah, a shield.
Exactly. It effectively turns an international symbol of peace into a powerful tool for domestic campaign narratives, diverting public attention. And experts suggest this, above all, is why the committee guards its independence so fiercely. They don't want to be used that way.
That makes a lot of sense. So, given all this scrutiny, the expert concerns, the potential pitfalls, where does the process actually stand now, based on the most recent reporting?
Well, the recent analysis, looking at reporting coming as late as 2025 and citing folks close to the process, Nobel historians, it suggests the odds for an award in this specific case remain low.
Still low, despite the nominations.
Still low. The complexity of the case, the mixed verifiable outcomes combined with the intense domestic political heat surrounding the figure, it makes the committee extremely cautious.
Understandably.
They are acutely aware of the risk of being seen as a partisan actor, of getting drawn into another country's internal politics. So the emphasis remains firmly on verifiable, durable impact and a sustained long-term commitment to peace building.
Right.
Which, in the view of many experts tracking this, these particular efforts haven't yet fully demonstrated over time.
Okay, that's a crucial distinction. So we've covered a lot of the history, the mechanics, the specific case studies, the intense political drama. Let's try to wrap up now by connecting this whole persistent debate back to the listener. Why does this whole spectacle even matter in the bigger picture?
It matters immensely.
Because the prize. Fundamentally, it's about defining what we, as a global society, choose to value as the very definition of peace, isn't it?
Exactly. That's the core issue. The polarization around this specific nomination process, it really reveals that the definition of peace itself is highly culturally variable. It's context dependent.
How so? Can we see that in how different regions view this?
Oh, clearly.
Right.
We can see this variation just by looking through different regional lenses.
Okay, like where?
Well, in the U.S., as we've discussed, the debate is almost entirely polarized along party lines, right? It serves as a litmus test for partisan loyalty. The discussion there is mostly centered on political legacy, power, and who gets to claim the moral victory in the ongoing narrative war.
Right. Very U.S.-centric view. What about elsewhere?
Contrast that with observers in, say, Europe, and especially the Nordic countries, where the prize originates. Their primary focus tends to be on institutional caution, the importance of multilateralism, procedural independence for the committee, and often a preference for long-term humanitarian and development work as the foundation for peace. They're inherently skeptical of transactional or unilateral diplomacy that seems to prioritize speed over established international norms or institutions.
Okay, different priorities. What about the Middle East itself, regarding the Abraham Accords?
Well, if you look toward the Middle East, the view fractures again, quite dramatically. For the Gulf states that signed on, the Abraham Accords were largely celebrated as a pragmatic win. Good for normalization, trade, regional stability. It suggests peace, for them, is perhaps primarily defined by economic integration and shared security interests against common rivals.
A very pragmatic definition.
Very pragmatic. But conversely, the Palestinian leadership and their supporters across the region and globally saw the Accords as actively bypassing their core claims regarding justice, sovereignty, and self-determination.
Right.
For them, a peace defined merely as transactional stability between states, rather than achieving comprehensive justice for people, is fundamentally insufficient, maybe even counterproductive.
Wow. So the decision doesn't just judge the diplomat or the deal. It implicitly judges the underlying global philosophy of peace itself. Are we valuing pragmatic stability more? Or structural justice?
Yeah.
Or institutional cooperation?
Precisely. And this specific case, this whole debate around it, forces several really enduring philosophical questions of modern statecraft sharply into focus for all of us.
Such as?
Well, the first one is, can highly visible, media-driven diplomacy, the summits, the spectacles, the immediate announcements, can that actually produce measurable, durable peace? Or is it mostly just a performance designed for domestic political consumption back home?
Performance versus substance. What else?
Second, and this is perhaps the most challenging one, how should international prizes like the Nobel weigh a leader's domestic governance record, their human rights record, their approach to democratic norms? How should those weigh alongside their foreign policy achievements?
Should they be totally separate metrics?
Or should the criteria demand a more holistic leader, someone who advances the cause of peace and justice both at home and abroad? There's no easy answer there.
No, definitely not. Any other big questions?
And finally, a question that ties right back to the committee's mandate and maybe our media environment. Does the relentless dramatization of diplomacy, the staged signing ceremonies, the high-profile meetings, the constant media coverage, does that ultimately enhance the cause of peace? Or does it maybe dilute or distract from the painstaking, complex, often quiet, long-term work of true peace building that usually happens behind the scenes without all the fanfare?
That's a great question. Does the showmanship help or hurt the actual work?
Right.
Well, this has been a really necessary deep dive into one of the world's most scrutinized awards. We've tried to dissect the history, the mechanics, analyze the mixed results of the specific diplomatic case studies, and explore that profound psychological impact the whole debate has on a deeply polarized public.
It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. The debate around the Nobel Peace Prize, it feels just as important as the prize itself sometimes, because it forces us, as a global society, to really articulate what we truly mean, what we truly value when we talk about lasting peace.
And maybe let me leave you, the listener, with this final provocative thought to mull over. The decision to award the Peace Prize any year is fundamentally an act of historical storytelling.
Storytelling.
Yeah, it's a decision about which methods of conflict resolution, which approaches to peace we collectively choose to elevate, to remember, to enshrine in global memory. And the story we choose to endorse today, whether it's a story that emphasizes transactional speed and disruption, or maybe one that values sustained justice and patient institutional work, that story will set the incentives for states, for leaders, for movements, for generations to come.
Wow.
So maybe consider for a moment, what story about conflict resolution in this modern, very volatile era do you believe the global community should be telling?
A powerful question to end on. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We'll see you next time.